So welcome everybody to yet another STC webinar. It's our 10th one today, all about cyber risks and opportunities within the supply chain, delivered by CYSIAM. Should be a very interesting session. As you all know, these are part of a series of webinars that we're doing. We've got at least another 4 scheduled, and there's further ones that we're working on. So please consult our website to see which ones are coming up. But we have a lot of sessions around business strategy. We've got some sessions around funding as well, all coming up. And so we'll continue to deliver sort of useful webinars with powerful information that can benefit your business. So please check it out on the website. As you know, all the webinars are available on our YouTube channel as well. So if there's any ones that you want to catch up with, including this one, we'll upload it as soon as we've finished. Please check out our YouTube channel and catch up on previous ones that have taken place. But we'll kick off now with today's session. So I'll hand over, I think, first to David and then to James, who will tell us all about sort of cyber risks and practical things that we can do to protect us. So over to you, David, right?
Yep.
Well, I can do a bit of an intro on the company if you like first, Dave.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Pim. It's great to see the increase in webinars over this period of lockdown. It seems to have speeded up the use of technology, which is probably relevant to the presentation we're going to talk about. So I'll just introduce the company first. So we, CYSIAM, we provide expertise in offensive security and critical incident response. Using mainly our government and military cyber expertise, we aim to train our clients to be able to protect themselves and to respond to attacks and breaches when they occur. We're CREST certified. We work on projects in the most critical parts of government and public services. We also work with organisations in the private sector which recognise the threat to their data and operations and are ready to invest intelligently in their own security and that of their clients. So a little bit of background. You can find more about us on LinkedIn and on the web and what have you. So we'll just introduce ourselves. Dave, you might want to share the slide deck from...
I think, Pim, you need to share the screen, is that right?
Sorry, Dave, you should have the function to do that at the bottom of your screen, if all is well. Should be the green share screen button.
Got you. Sorry, I assume because you took it off me, you were going to give me it back. Yeah. Apologies.
No, you had the power all along.
Ah, damn.
Have the power.
Hi, guys. Right, so there we go. Sorry, James, back over to you.
Yeah, okay. So we'll just introduce ourselves first, so you've got a bit of background on us as individuals. So I'm James Kench, Commercial Director here at CYSIAM. I started my career as a buyer for Rakel radar defence systems, which through a number of acquisitions turned into Thales, a big French-owned defence company. And I ended up as head of subcontract management for the Thales Land Systems division. So most of that was buying subsystems. I then was a commercial lead for a Mott MacDonald contract in Iran, based in Tehran, which was deploying the first countrywide mobile phone network into Iran. I worked on the UK government's Firelink project, which was about installing datacomms into the fire services in Great Britain. I then worked for SOCA, the Serious Organised Crime Agency, on their Schengen Information Systems project, which was a case management system. And then I worked for 8 years or so as project manager and commercial lead for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office overseas capacity building program team. Part of that time was on the cyber capacity building team, which is where I met Dave. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, James. Hi, guys. So Dave Allen. So a long technical background. Started as a mechanical engineer and doing a big pipe work, proper engineering when I was a boy. And then joined the Army, communication specialist. Spent the best part of 10 years to and fro into various hot sandy places. Then joined the Foreign Office, headed up the IT department for a while, and then moved into more of a strategic outward reaching role, trying to sort of build relationships to make the UK safer, stronger, and more prosperous in cyberspace by working with our foreign partners and allies to build international cooperation capability. My job now really is more of the same. So what the partners have become commercial partners rather than international partners. So our role really, my role in particular, is working with board level senior members of staff and helping them to identify risks within their business, whether it's the supply chain, whether it's the strategy, whether it's the technical roadmap, and really helping people to prosper in the digital age. So with that, I'll just skate on to the next slide. What we don't want this to be is a big sort of everything's really scary. There's nothing you can do. You should all be really worried about everything in the world, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. What we're trying to get across is just that cyber itself sounds technical, sounds complicated, but the reality is some basic things done well get rid of most of the problems and most of the threats. So I'm going to give you a quick canter through some of the threats before James comes into the subject matter around supply chain specifically. So the sorts of threats are activists. They're anonymous. You might have seen them in news with Black Lives Matter targeting the police, various other sort of eco groups, and then script kiddies who are they tend to be referred like the guys in the bedroom that aren't particularly sophisticated but are able to use tools and able to use pre-prepared scripts to launch attacks. Then you've got criminal gangs who are mainly motivated by the acquisition of money from other people's pockets, and then nation-state level type threats. I think what's important is that there aren't really clearly defined blocks of threats. That they tend to sort of all blur into one big sliding scale of sophistication, with script kiddies probably at the bottom, working its way up through the sort of the Premier League of nation states to sort of Russia, the US, China at the top. And the risks to you as an individual are slightly different to you as a company, but they're all broadly trying to get to the same thing, which is trying to have some sort of effect. Now, whether that effect is money, whether the effect is extortion or getting you to do things you don't want to do. So I don't know if you saw the Ashley Madison breach a long time ago, but that was a good example where hackers used the database from the Ashley Madison website to blackmail people. So Ashley Madison was a website that enabled people to cheat on their partners with other people. So people were using the data from that to sort of leverage people's fears about getting caught. The theft of money directly, so whether people getting your bank details and trying to steal cash, or trying to elicit your details out of you so they can buy things on your behalf, like stealing your Amazon account or things like that. And then harassment generally. So you see it a lot in schools, you see it a lot on Twitter, people hiding behind the relative anonymity of the internet to be mean. Building up, you've got organizational risks. And I think it all boils down to money, but the sorts of things that people try to affect are your reputation, your intellectual property, the directly extorting money out of you as an individual within your organization or the organization generally, redirecting payment terms, that sort of thing, and the operational effectiveness of your organization. So put that into context, for a reputation, it might be the fact that you've been breached generally, and the fact that you as a company have potentially managed data incorrectly, whether it's been storing things unencrypted or whatever. That has a reputational impact on your business and a reputational impact on your clients and customers wanting to work with you in the future. The intellectual property speaks for itself. The Chinese were on a massive campaign several years ago, stealing lots of intellectual property from companies, much like the sort of companies you get in the STC, to build their own copycat versions of what the West was doing. Financial is North Korea, great example of that, where they were going around hacking banks around Asia and stealing all the cash to support their government. They were behind the SWIFT attacks in Bangladesh, allegedly. And then the operational effectiveness. So this is really around what impact, what effect could an attacker have on an organization to stop it doing what it needs to do. So if you're an organization without the internet for 1, 2, 3 days, how would it manage? Now we're on lockdown. If you lost access to your email accounts, how would you as an organization cope without access to those things? And I think for all of us, our company included, we're so heavily leveraged into the digital space that it would have a massive impact. Just the ability to invoice, the ability to get paid on time, the ability to pay your staff, all these things are all linked to some sort of digital infrastructure. Enough on that. So why do people use the internet as an attack vector? And I think that the biggest thing is the asymmetry. On a macro scale, if you look at how Russia have built their cyber capability, knowing that they can't compete with the West in terms of building tanks and airplanes, they've heavily invested into cyber weapons, and that's really brought about a parity almost in power across nation states, for a disparity of investment. And I think criminals are starting to see the same thing. They don't have to invest a lot of money. They don't have to have bags of tools to break into your organization or have whole supply chains of sort of obfuscation to steal diamonds, when they can just break straight into an organization and steal the cash. And because of the democratization, if you like, of the internet and of services, it's really easy to buy those skills online. So I'm not sure how well you can see it on your screens, but on the top of the 3 boxes on the right hand side of the screen, that's somebody just selling their hacking services. So you can pay by the hour, you can pay by the service, you can pay by, so if you want to DDoS someone, so you want to stop, a distributed denial of service, which means you wouldn't be able to access your website, for example, that's a couple of £100. If you want someone to launch a sustained attack, then it's price on application. It really is a proper marketplace of buying and selling sort of these sort of services. On the bottom there is just a few websites that we've scraped from the dark web that shows just how easy it is to get hold of PayPal details or credit card details. So hackers tend to get all this stuff in bulk. They tend to get dumps of credit card details and then sell them on for like 50 pence each. And maybe out of 1,000, 10 will work, but those 10 will be quite lucrative. So all this stuff sloshing around all the time. The barriers to entry are low. You don't need any skills. You just need to know where to look online to buy the skills. Even a few YouTube videos, you can learn how to do lots of basic sort of hacking. The international response, the response generally is quite immature. The response from the police, the response from other countries, the ability to track people across international borders, extradition from Russia, for example, all these things are really hard to do, and we haven't quite caught up with the sophistication of criminals. The same with attribution. It's really hard to find out who did what to whom and when. So whenever we get called out to an instance, the first thing the client wants to know is who did it to me, and it's really hard for us to try and explain that. Well, actually, that's really hard. That the best thing that we can do is just stop it from happening now and stop it from happening again, and prepare you for if it does happen again. Trying to find out who did it and pinpoint an IP address to a particular location and an individual, it's just not worth it. There's a lot of investments in money for not a lot of certainty in the ultimate origin of the attack. And then effects and impact, low collateral in terms of it can be highly targeted to an organization, and nobody has to get hurt. I don't have to punch somebody to steal their money. And so I think that in and of itself pushes it down the priority list for maybe law enforcement. The other point to mention is that a lot of the data is already out there. So companies get breached all the time, and the output of those breaches are generally widely available. Just as an example, on GitHub, which is a code repository and a code sort of a website, there's one person who's put on there 50 gigabytes of username and password credentials. So you can just download that now, and it's all stuff that's been breached on the internet. It's for educational purposes and for research purposes, but it's all there. And once it's there, it's very difficult to take it back. So I think what I've shown there on the screen, you've got LinkedIn. So 164 million email addresses and passwords were leaked or were exposed. so if anyone's reused those passwords, if you've got the same password, for example, on your LinkedIn account as you have for your corporate email account, all somebody's got to do is reuse that email address and password, and they've got into your corporate account. This is why it's so important to try and find a way that works for you to not reuse passwords. Also, the Wayback Machine is an archive of the internet, so that regularly archives websites, web pages, tweets, all this sort of stuff. So if you've got a badly configured website from 2 years ago that might have some data exposed in a database behind a website somewhere, people can still access that version of your website. So it's really important not to reuse passwords, not just on your personal accounts, but on anything that holds your data. And then in the top right center is a website called Have I Been Pwned? Really useful. We use it all the time, and it's just a way to check whether your email address has been released in any breach database. So the guy who runs this website called Troy Hunt, him and his team go around acquiring all these breach data sets, and they've got billions and billions and billions of records. So chances are, if you've been caught up in a breach somewhere, then you will be in that database. They don't give you the password, but they just tell you, yes, you have been breached. Yes, you were breached in this database, and this is when it happened. So it's a really useful tool just to check your personal email addresses, your business email addresses, whether you're in that website. The fact that you're in there doesn't matter. All that matters is you change your password from the one that was breached to a different one, and the problem's sort of gone away. So it's nothing to be too worried about, but it's just a really useful tool. In practice, the way all that I've just mentioned works, or the way that it can work, is so I get hold of somebody's email address. I run that through Have I Been Pwned? Now that to me gives me if it's in there and it comes back, it's been hacked under this database. As an attacker, I know, great. So let's pick on Pim. So Pim, I check Pim's email address, put it into Have I Been Pwned? It comes back with, yes, he was breached in a LinkedIn database back in 2014 or whenever it was. Right, nice one. So now I know I've got at least a valid username and a valid password from a few years ago. Let's hope that Pim's lazy and doesn't change his password often on his accounts. So now I'll use that email and password to just spray as many accounts as I can with pim@hotmail.com or pim@stc.com or whatever, and just try that same pair over and over again. All I've got to do is get into one of those things. Once I'm in, I've then got access to contacts, other email addresses, other email accounts. I've got access to whatever other accounts are associated with that email account, whether it be Amazon, bank details, whatever. And then my next job is then to figure out what I do with that information. So what I can then do is exploit the trust that Pim has with his colleagues and send an email directly from Pim's email account saying, hey guys, can you please log into the website? I think we've been breached. Can you change your details? Whether it's an email from the STC to the user of the STC, or whether it's an email to another part of a business that Pim manages to run. So then people wouldn't be suspicious of that email because it's come from a reputable source. It's come from a reliable, trusted email address, i.e. Pim. Everyone trusts Pim. So without questioning it, I would then maybe follow that email address. I'd maybe click on that link. I'd maybe do what I normally wouldn't do if it come from a stranger. And then at that point is when I can then start to exploit your trust in Pim's email to harvest your credentials and go after you as an individual, you as an organization. So that's just one way data can be used. It's not that hard. It doesn't take a lot of effort, but it's also really easy to defend against. Simply changing your passwords, simply implementing two-factor authentication on your accounts gets rid of most of this stuff. But that's just you as an individual, and that's just you as an organization. I think.
Sorry, Dave, just very quickly to reassure everybody, I do use different passwords and I do change them regularly. So please don't get any ideas. But yeah, thanks.
But what the purpose of this presentation is that you can control all that as an individual. Your business can control all this data yourselves. What you can't control are your suppliers and your clients and your customers and everything else around you. And using that example with Pim, that was an example of a supply chain attack, in that it was Pim and the trust with Pim has and his company with a different company is what I exploit as an attacker. And you as the recipient of that email can't control what Pim does with his stuff. All you can do is have a level of trust that he knows what he's doing, or use some of the methods, which James will go into in greater detail. So that's the scary bit done. And over to James to talk about the good stuff. I think I'm going to drive on, James.
Yeah, I think so, Dave.
Cool.
I think actually later slides, some of the individual sentences come out, so you might just need to kind of just fill the slide up as it appears.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Dave. That's obviously a load of detail that applies directly to your organizations. You know, you can see immediately how that's going to be useful, understanding a bit more about how the threat manifests itself. But what about the supply chain? This is what we're here to talk about. It is that kind of second level of control. You don't have as much control over another company as you do over your own. So first of all, I thought we'd take a quick look at the changing use of technology and how that affects supply chain risks. So broadly, we break it up into two parts. So there's IT, information technology, and there's OT, operational technology. IT, you probably all have had some experience of moving to cloud. Maybe that's personally saving photos onto iCloud, or maybe your business is using kind of Microsoft 365 or Amazon Web Services or something to host data and to run applications. It was a tentative start with moving to cloud technology, especially in government, but they needed to develop the trust with the suppliers, but it's becoming increasingly prevalent. Software as a service, even infrastructure as a service. So this is renting infrastructure rather than having to have that big capital outlay of buying it yourself, is becoming more and more common. The opportunities of doing that are so big that they're starting to outweigh the risks of doing it, even in the most risk-averse organizations. So, you know, the pressure is move to cloud. If you don't move to cloud, you risk losing the edge that you have over your competitors. And similarly in operational technology. So this is, you know, outsourcing automated decision-making through artificial intelligence in some cases. You know, this is manufacturing plants that are making decisions on their own without the need for people there. Obviously huge benefits in doing that. You know, there's certainty in how these operations run. You take the human element out of it, but you know, you also bring a lot of risk in there as well. The way that you have to manage your suppliers in these types of relationships has changed as a result. So there's clearly not necessarily a deliverable item. You know, if you're hiring some space on an AWS platform and you're using some applications on that, you don't receive any deliverables into your warehouse. So your contract would tend to focus on key performance indicators. It would focus on service availability. Suppliers, as a result of this, have broader and deeper access to your systems, maybe to your premises. They may well have access to your critical data. I had a look at I've been reviewing the AWS platform terms and conditions that you sign up to if you want to use Amazon Web Services, which is a very common supplier for this type of thing. And those terms allow Amazon to have access to this data as necessary to manage the service, and also by government order. So if you imagine that you don't know which data center your data is being held in unless you specify it. So which government is that? You know, where in the world is that? And we'll come on to an example later where, you know, the country that's hosting your data might have powers that you don't really appreciate. The relationship with your supplier when they're providing, particularly infrastructure as a service, has to be a long-term relationship. It's got to be a trusted relationship. Again, you know, where there's trust, there's potential for exploitation. And clear interdependencies can develop between you and your supplier in a way that they wouldn't with a more traditional supply chain. So the risk profile changes, you know, with these new ways of engaging. The risk profile for IT, you know, unauthorized access to IT through the supply chain might impact your confidentiality of your information. If someone starts mucking around with information, it might impact on the integrity. It might impact on the availability. You know, these all could cause your business some serious problems. On the operational technology side, you can imagine a manufacturing plant that's hacked into. The harms of cyber breaches can be related to, safety, reliability, availability, but also, the continuing operation of your business. Service provision, again, contracts with facilities management companies, for example. If they're interfered with, they can affect timely delivery. They can affect, again, affecting the operations of your business. So that's a quick look at the changing use of tech and what that means on the engagements within the supply chain, and again, what that means in terms of the risk profile that needs to be managed. Okay, Dave. So this next slide, first of all, the diagram here, it's quite a simple diagram, but it's kind of useful to just reiterate the fact that you have real control over that green zone. That's your business. You have some control, but less over that first tier of supply, which is in the blue zone there. You have a contractual relationship with them. You can influence, you have a direct relationship with them, and you can influence that in certain ways, which we'll go and talk about in a minute. But beyond that, you actually have very little direct control. So there's a lesson in there, kind of make sure that these controls that are available to you are used and exploited as that kind of the layers of the onion kind of expand and move out. So we thought we'd give you some examples of some case studies where supply chain has been involved in breach, because there's nothing like a real life example to learn lessons from. We didn't want to use the old, the BA website hack and the Marriott hack. It's everywhere. It's all over LinkedIn and stuff, and it's all a little bit boring. So I thought we'd focus on examples that we've encountered in our day-to-day delivery. So the first one revolved around a CCTV system in a large exhibition centre. So the exhibition centre had previously had a supplier of CCTV. Dave, you can chip in if there's any tech detail that needs to be added into this explanation. But the exhibition centre had fallen out acrimoniously with their CCTV provider and had taken it in-house. The connection from the CCTV to the outside world was vulnerable. We found it on a vulnerability scan, and it gave access into their central functionality. On top of that, just being able to muck around with the CCTV system for an exhibition centre that is mandated to have live CCTV, otherwise they can't operate, gives any hacker the ability to stop their operation, which is critical. Anything else to add on that one, Dave?
No, I think all of that is so a colleague of mine and myself were gently escorted out of the boardroom when we started to divulge all this information, and I think that the biggest surprise to them was one of the key access points into the business was a supplier that was bottom of their list of things to worry about, because the value of the contract was so small. They hadn't considered that supplier as a threat, and so didn't make the list of things to worry about. And what we were doing was turning that on its head by saying, actually, it wasn't the fact that the supplier cost so much money that was the risk. It is the fact that they had the most access that was the biggest risk to your organization. Therefore, it's just trying to get organizations to think slightly differently about how they qualify the risk a supplier poses to their business. It's not about the cost. It's for data security. It's about the access. And that was one of the big things that come up. And as they started arguing about it, we sort of slowly left the room. But it's the really interesting bit to be a part of, was seeing a board trying to untangle how this sort of set of circumstances have come about, and it's because of how they qualified the risk.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. The next example was a government institution which had been breached, called on our services, and we, after analysing some of the data and the log files, found out that it was through the air conditioning system. So the company supplying the air conditioning system had installed a server, which was unpatched. That server was exposed to the network via, again, an unpatched remote access gateway. So this is a gateway that allows the air conditioning company to dial in remotely and service and maintain the units. Someone had hacked into that from the other side of the world, and potentially got access to this government's institutions' IT network, and they were in the process of setting up a ransomware attack. So, access in through the supplier, the kind of weak element in the chain. Dave, chip in if there's anything more you want to add to that. I think we probably.
No, I think it was more severe than that. I think that they had ransomware this area. They just hadn't pivoted around the rest of the network.
Okay.
I think the important thing to remember about this one was it wasn't a targeted attack. It was they'd looked on, or one way to do it is you look on a tool called Shodan, and it shows all the open RDP gateways in the world. So it's really, really easy to just find a collection of vulnerable things and have a go. And that's what the hackers in this situation weren't particularly sophisticated. They just used an open source tool, found the vulnerable points, and had a go. The password hint on the remote access gateway was stupidly easy to guess. So it looks like they'd broken in that way, even though it was unpatched. They hadn't need to break into it because the password was so weak. And then once they got in, then they ransomwared it. And it wasn't particularly good ransomware. We managed to reverse it all, and they hadn't pivoted around the network. But it was just an example of where it wasn't a targeted attack. That there was no sort of malicious intent on the victim itself. It was just a couple of guys chancing their arm at a particular vulnerable remote access gateway.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Next example is a company which designs, hosts, and manages websites on behalf of people and on behalf of organizations. One of their senior directors rang us up close to tears. So most of their websites that they manage were being hosted remotely. It happened to be a data center in Romania. I'm not sure whether they were aware of the location, but the data center was hacked. Now, this is a company whose entire reason for existing is about website hosting. And if all that gets locked up and ransomed, they're in trouble. That's a critical failure of their company. So again, that's a supplier, first tier supplier, holding critical data assets. And then the fourth one is one that Dave mentioned earlier. It was a financial services company that we did some due diligence on as part of an acquisition exercise. They'd outsourced their IT to a managed service provider. And there were a number of concerns about the contractual relationship between those two companies that we had that we recommended were put right. But one of them, as Dave mentioned, was the liability cap was for, I think, 3 months or 6 months of the contract value, which was nowhere near the kind of financial consequences of a critical breach. So they hadn't really thought about it when they set the contract up. They hadn't thought about it. They just thought we've outsourced the problem, and that's it. And it needs more. It needs more than that. It needs more thinking. Okay,
I think that they went as far as saying on the risk register, the risk for security was outsource IT, and that was it. It was that blunt. And it wasn't good enough.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so the next slide is just builds on that really. The cyber resilience is about layers of confidence. There isn't one. There's not a panacea. There's not something you can buy which will make this problem go away. It's about thinking about it in layers of confidence and working with your key suppliers to make sure that your risk profile is as low as possible. Spend some time and be aware of your surroundings, your commercial surroundings, your regulatory surroundings. As we've seen from some of those examples, have a think about it. Have a think about the legal construct of your commercial relationship with your key providers. Flow down standards and regulations to them. You're quite able to do that in contracts. Understand what the standards are and what the regulations are. And if they're not legally mandatory, we'll flow them down. And where you can't, where it's most appropriate that you hold the risk, it might be an idea to take out some cyber insurance. There's no point in making a supplier responsible for risk that is best managed by you. So, have a think about that and where it best lies. Bear in mind though that these are methods of passive protection, right? They're not active defenses. They're not training. They're not, there's all sorts of other things you can do. one thing that we've found is that it needs to be taken seriously by senior stakeholders. So with your key suppliers, make sure that their board are behind this. It's not just the IT manager, or it's not just board members paying lip service to this, that they really understand that you're taking this seriously and your business with them depends upon them taking it seriously. And as you've kind of seen with Dave's conversation earlier, this is an evolving and maturing landscape. So keep an eye on it, stay current, understand what the issues are. Okay, so the next slide is about, well, what we thought we'd do is to present what we would use to assess our clients' maturity. And because we think this might be useful in assessing your supply chain security. So this is a maturity model to enable us to kind of target our solutions with our clients. But you can see what it's saying there is along those 7 swim lanes, from governance down to supply chain, do an assessment with your supplier and work out which of these quadrants they sit in. Are they confident that they're secure? Are they in the top right corner there? In which case you might want to get, call the services of a third party to come and do some simulated exercises to actually make sure that they are. If they're not confident, you need another approach. But the important point here is that there are 7 swim lanes here, right? This isn't just about technology, number 3, making sure they've got the right firewalls and what have you in place. It's about governance, which is the organizational structures and stuff that sits behind this. It's about the physical environment. It's about the supply chain that they have beyond themselves. So, this is a chain of companies that are all linked together. Make sure that the way that they engage that supply chain on your behalf is robust and meets the requirements that you have. I think these slides will be circulated afterwards, so you can have a look at this tool, and hopefully it will generate some thoughts about how you might engage with your supply chain and what aspects you might want to be thinking about when trying to get this right.
I think all I'll say on that is, James, that for us as a company, we never compromise on the breadth of that assessment. So when we look at other companies and we look at their maturity or their risk, we only ever compromise on the depth that we go into each one of those categories. But we always assess all 7 because we think for an organization, all 7 things are of equal importance. But sometimes it might be a company that doesn't have a lot of technology, therefore we won't spend a lot of effort on testing. We'll spend more time on the governance because they've got a really immature board or whatever it is, but we never compromise on the breadth, only the depth. And also just we're in the process at the moment of developing a web app version of our assessment tool for supply chain. So I hope that'll be out in sometime in September. I don't know what it'll look like here, but we've got all the foundational bits ready and a developer ready to sort of build it. So watch the space for that.
So thanks, Dave. Yeah, whatever the web app looks like, it will focus on these areas here. And this is the structure that we used when we went in to assess that IT company on behalf of the company that was acquiring them. It's an overlay. It allows us to capture all sorts of aspects of a company's supplier cybersecurity maturity, and it could be useful. For assessing your supply chain. Okay, so next slide talks about contracts. Contracts are useful in determining the relationship between you and your supplier. I mean, that might sound obvious, but they're often seen as a kind of a boring necessity and something that gathers dust in a drawer. But actually, particularly at the early stages of a contract, it's a really good opportunity to actually think about aspects of the deal and capture them on paper, so that both parties understand. It's easy to buy something from a brochure or something that you see advertised simply on the functionality of the product or service that you're buying. But there are all sorts of other aspects of a contractual relationship, and it's well worth getting those recorded at the outset. So we've highlighted a number of areas of the contract negotiation here that might be appropriate to cyber security with your key suppliers. I mentioned earlier risk apportionment. Well, make sure your contract captures the areas of risk and make sure that those areas that are most appropriate are with that party. It may be appropriate for you to hold some risk and not try and farm that out to suppliers. So you need to think about how that's going to work. The contract will need to record obligations on each side. Who needs to do what? So, flow down obligations as and when you think they're appropriate. Liabilities we touched on again. You want to cap consequential losses, but flow liabilities down. Make sure the supplier is cognizant of exactly what their liability is here. It'll help them it'll help you focus them on the areas that you think are most important. Auditing rights. You don't have auditing rights by law. You need to put them into a contract to make sure that you've got them. And you can go in and have a look through their books, and you can have a look through all sorts of aspects of their operation to make sure that they're doing what you want them to be doing. Compliance, insurances, routes for dispute escalation, another very important point. Unless you specify a route for dispute escalation, it falls back to the legal route, which is eventually into arbitration and then court. You don't really want that. You want to prepare something to allow disputes to be managed in a way that you both agree they should be managed at the outset. You don't want to be falling out with your suppliers. So good contracts, thorough, well understood between both parties, but using them in anger is a last resort ideally. But you can use the negotiation bit at the beginning to make sure that the obligations on the parties are clear. Okay, so the next thing we can do is flow down compliances. So some compliances, some legal requirements. So GDPR is company, whether you put it in a contract or not, the company has to comply with GDPR regulations. But the contract is a useful tool for maybe highlighting that. And also specifying who the data controller is. So there are some details, even if it's a legal requirement, there are some details that can be brought out and kind of raising the profile of them. You can flow down standards through the contract. You can flow down cybersecurity standards, ISO 27001, Cyber Essentials, and the other ones. But they have their limitations, But sometimes, unless you put some of these standards in the contracts, they won't necessarily apply. You can assure your supply chain. You can put requirements into the contract, obligations into the contract for you to be able to tailor your approach. The last point on there, scenario-based plans. So you can put clauses into a contract to make sure that your supplier is adhering to a business continuity provision, and you can ask them to demonstrate that they've done that and make them run through scenarios so that you can assure yourself that they are ready and prepared in case of a cyber attack. We mentioned earlier about making sure that risks reside with the party best placed to hold them. And that could be you. There's no point trying to make a supplier responsible for a risk that best resides with you. And in those cases where you're holding the risk, it might be an idea for you to take out some cyber insurance in order to help manage that risk to a level that's acceptable to you. We're not insurance brokers. The cyber insurance marketplace is quite immature. So we'd recommend approaching a broker and having a chat with them about it. It might be useful, it might not, but have a think about it. Bear in mind though, there are a number of court cases at the moment where companies have claimed and the insurance companies haven't paid out. So just be a bit cautious about what's included and what isn't within your insurance policy. But it could be part of a suite of tools for your cyber strategy. Just thinking about the time for the moment, we want some time for questions and answers. So let's skip on to the last slide. So key takeaways. What do we really want you to leave this seminar and take away with you? Well, be aware. Your supply chain could well be your weakness. Think, we're in this business and we see this all the time. The supply chain being used for attackers to pivot into your business. Just be aware of that and think about the fact the supply chain could be your weakness. it's about layers of protection. It's not a single thing that will put this right. So bear that in mind. Contracts are useful tools to manage supply chain risk. We can help with that. We do help companies with this, but they need to be used correctly. They need to be used appropriately. A off-the-shelf contract is probably not going to be right. You need to put some thought and effort into getting it right for your business. The compliance environment is going to get tougher. BA, after their website hack, were fined by the Information Commissioner's Office £185 million, which is 4% of their global turnover. So the numbers are huge. The authorities have some teeth and they are starting to use it. Insurance is a specialist subject. Talk to a broker if you think you need it. Don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions. You know, they're working for you after all. And actually, like Dave said, a small investment up front may well avoid significant exposure. So just have a think about that. Do the basics right. And we thought we'd leave you with a nice little quote from Mitch Ratcliffe. Our MD is really fond of this one. I'll let you read it for yourselves. So I hope that's been of use. And I think, Pim, you were going to...
yeah, no, thanks for that.
Questions and answers.
I thought it was great. I mean, does anybody have any particular questions they wants to ask or any comments they wanted to make? Any chance? I mean, either like raise your hand physically or do that electronically. Right, so Moira, yeah.
Hi. I'm trying to flag this thing and it's not working. Never mind. My little waving thing isn't working. Yeah, two great presentation, guys, and hello, Dave. Seen you for a while. One question and then just an observation, really, because some of you know, in a previous life, I was a lawyer. I still am, but I don't do that anymore. And in that role as an in-house counsel, two things really struck me in this area. And my first question is about the big data platforms like AWS and so on.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that? I mean, at the end of the, I went through I was in-house counsel for a large dental group. Okay, so we had massive amount of highly sensitive stuff. Obviously, our IT provider, specialist IT provider, was cloud-based, and that cloud was residing with AWS. Fine.
Yeah.
All of the stuff you're talking about in terms of who bears the risk was obviously a concern, and I was very concerned actually, not about it being AWS per se, but at the end of the day, no one's door is completely sealed shut, even AWS's, was my simplistic, approach to it. But at the end of the day, we sort of had to just, we ended up with this major IT supplier who's well understood the questions I was asking. But I suppose, not surprisingly, his response back was, or their response back was, what do you expect, in a sense, what do you expect us to do about it? Because I've looked at AWS terms, and as you say, they're wide open. So I'm not sure ultimately, those of us in, your average SME or even large company, I'm not sure what we can do about that other than just put the practical, physical checks and balances into place to stop it ever being a problem. So that's one observation. But what I did find, thinking about your point about negotiating on contracts, what I did find was, and I'd be interested in your observation on this, not with this major supplier because they were a big supplier, but with other suppliers, and let's take your infrastructure, supply is a classic one. It is so, the knowledge of this area, even amongst IT suppliers, is so immature that it's very difficult, unless you're dealing with very big outfits. It's very difficult when you're typically dealing with the sales guy to get beyond the, oh, well, we don't really know, I'm sure everything we do is right kind of response. So it's actually quite difficult to get to a point where you're having a sensible conversation about risk. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because the people you're talking to just think you're being difficult or you're over-egging it. And really what you're trying to do is find out actually exactly, I mean, with no knowledge really, just know how to ask questions, just asking questions about, well, how safe are the doors in your house, as it were, that we're going to put our data into. So it's quite tricky actually, getting businesses to even understand the questions, let alone get to the point where you can feel some security around it. I'd be interested in your observations as to, you know, how you see your clients tackling that, if at all.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, Dave, you can pick up and answer quite a bit of that, I guess, in a minute.
Yeah.
But I think on the AWS thing, so there are things you can do with in the contract with AWS particularly. You can specify where you want your data to be held geographically, if that means something to you. So there are these little options. They're kind of hidden away in the terms, and they do give you some opportunity to tailor your contract, even with a massive giant like Amazon. So they have started to recognise that things like this are of concern to some of their customers. But if obviously if you don't do that, if you don't specify, then they'll put your data wherever it suits them. Dave, anything more to add to that?
No, I was going to say, I think you've still got the option to protect your data at rest and in transit. So you can still encrypt your data when it's at rest. You can still encrypt it in transit. So it depends on your risk appetite. We like to use a sort of consultancy sort of diagram, which is just a slide and scale of insecure, really secure, and then at one end you've got openness and easy to use, and the other end really difficult to use. And I think every company's got to decide where they are on that slide and scale, whether they want a completely open, completely easy to use, very user-friendly sort of capability, or right down the other end, well locked down, really secure, but it's going to be a bit more difficult to use. And it's really down to the individual to decide their risk appetite. As an independent company, our core job really is to advise on what the best solution is for that level of risk that the company wants to expose themselves to. But it's really a personal decision.
Yeah, I think with the small company issue, that is a real issue. You're quite right. We do see that quite a bit. Part of the solution is in understanding the risk to you and being able to articulate that properly to them. So, this seminar, for example, hopefully will arm you with some of the things that you need in order to have those negotiations with your suppliers. But there's also some legal support and some regulatory support that you can fall back on. You can flow down standards to them and ask them to go through the stages of qualification, of accrediting themselves to those standards. And there's nothing in a competitive environment. There's nothing like saying to them, well, so and so, my other option is qualified to this standard, and you're not. And that could be the tipping point. So. You could use competitive pressures. You could use your knowledge of the risk to try and support those negotiations. But you've got some examples from here about how supply chain vulnerabilities can affect you directly. This is a serious issue, and they should be taking it seriously. Otherwise, there'll be some consequences, and some of those consequences might be that they don't get your business.
May I ask an incremental question?
Go ahead, Anthony.
You talked about AWS. What about companies like Equinix who use the AWS system to take space and provide you with storage within that system?
In what context? So how secure is it?
The security, and had they got the same optionality on their contract, which I wrote down somewhere, your data where it's stored, have Equinix got the same clause in their contract?
Yeah, the contract that I looked at was the standard AWS infrastructure as a service contract, platform as a service contract. So they almost certainly will have the option to specify geographically where their data is held.
What about the American providers like digital realty and so forth?
I'd have to look at the specifics without knowing. Yeah, I'd have to have a look at them. But you know, these large providers of infrastructure and platform as a service are increasingly becoming, having to offer the same options as the big boys. You know, so if they're not offering things like being able to specify where your data is held or where it isn't held geographically, people will go to AWS. You know, so even the smaller providers are having to step up. The bigger providers are setting the benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose there's also an element with this sort of issue that you don't know what you don't know, and so I should imagine that it's engaging with the likes of yourselves and others that specialize in cybersecurity to help you navigate that, because I should imagine there's a lot of companies that wouldn't know how to interact with AWS and ask questions because they don't know which questions to ask. So I mean, as I said before, we'll share the webinars and your contact details and things. And I think by all means, follow up and bring the expertise in that you need for this sort of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, you saw in the tool that we presented, supply chain is one element of that assessment that we would do. So yeah, if you're really worried, call in the experts.
Mm. One of the things that kind of occurred to me as well with the whole thing, because you were obviously talking about your supply chain and that there might be weaknesses there and all that sort of stuff, but presumably it kind of also transfers up, because if they're not doing it already, I should imagine that bigger tier 1 suppliers would increasingly start to ask what your cybersecurity protocols are and how they can make sure that when they work with you, they remain safe and all that sort of stuff, and that you're not a liability to their cybersecurity system. So,
yeah,
even from a strategic business point of view, surely, it's going to add value to whatever pitch you do to a tier 1 supplier to kind of say, actually, when it comes to cybersecurity, we've got all of this stuff in place, and so we're secure, so you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. I presumably that will become, if it's not already, it'll become more and more of a factor going forward.
Pim, that's the holy grail of cybersecurity, and that it becomes a positive thing rather than something negative. And I think it's certainly a narrative that we're trying to promote, in that good security can be a positive differentiator when winning big contracts. So if you look at the likes of so some of the government frameworks we're on mandate you must have a minimum of cyber essentials just to be on it. And cyber essentials doesn't do a lot, but at least you've thought about it. At least it proves that you're thinking about it in a certain way. When we do penetration testing, which is a form of ethical hacking, a lot of our contracts require us to be CREST accredited, which means that we follow a standardized set of procedures and we've got the right insurance in place. And so we're able to deliver an effective, legally sort of approved service, if you like. And there are levels within that. So within our industry, we are quite mature at having those different benchmarks. I think it's just the industry generally needs to start to see security as a positive differentiator rather than something that they need to worry about and it costs a lot of money. But I think until the rest of the private sector starts making demands on their supply chain, you must have cyber essentials, you must be ISO 27001 accredited. Until people start making those sort of demands on their supply chain, it won't be seen in that context.
Yeah, even though it needs to be. One of the things from one of your slides, when you showed the slide with kind of like a little green circle, that's you, and then the blue circle, that's kind of like your supplier, and then the rest of it. I mean, presumably in the pandemic situation that we've had, and lots of people working from home, actually that blue circle kind of now also includes your own staff, doesn't it? Because if they're working from home and they're not particularly diligent with their own security in their home system, and presumably, that could be a vulnerability within your system as well, because presumably, lots of people log in from home into your servers and all that sort of stuff. So presumably, good housekeeping when it comes to cybersecurity with your staff and making sure they're on board and all that stuff is more important now than it ever was.
I think you're doing the basics is always really important, and I think now the attack surface is just exponentially grown. So you've got every individual in your company using their home router, and they're probably using the same network as they are for their personal emails and personal transactions. And you've got family members, kids on the same network as your business connection. So all the things that companies have been trying to do for a long time internally, it's a lot of effort. All of a sudden, that's just been exploded out to however many members of staff you've got across the world, and it's really hard to control. And there's no one solution, but some of the basic things like making sure you use a VPN for external connections, making sure that your passwords aren't reused, as in the previous example, making sure that you enable two-factor authentication on all the accounts you can, and make sure that you stay suspicious of unsolicited emails with even if they look really credible with attachments on. Just even if it means phoning a person and saying, "Have you just sent me this link? It looks a bit strange." Much rather have a look a bit silly for 5 seconds than ruin a company. So it's just about doing the basics. I think from our point of view, we see lots of big companies selling big AI products and all these big flashy things with lights on that will cost you £100,000, but will save you forever. And it's all nonsense if you haven't got the basics in place. You're just doing the basics that are free. They don't cost any money whatsoever normally. Just turning things on, doing the basics stops 90% of all the opportunistic attacks, which is what most things are realistically. Like that, there aren't lots of people in hoodies behind, like looking at Moira's company trying to steal all of the data. It's normally people that have cast a wide net and they find vulnerabilities in that wide net and then they go after them. So if you're not one of those vulnerabilities, then you're not part of that initial attack vector. And that's what we're trying to get rid of. And that's what the supply chain needs to get rid of, is not make themselves the weakest buffalo within that pack.
Yeah, so it's getting the bases right and just make sure you're not the easy target that they stumble upon, because and we were talking about this earlier, then they're not really necessarily looking or going for, bots, widgets, or whatever it is. They're just looking to see who might be vulnerable and then have a root round and see, because if Bob Widgets then is a supplier to BA and gives them an access into that, obviously the BA is a lot more attractive than, a lot more attractive target than Bob Widgets would be. And so it's kind of like, it's not necessarily about you, it's just how opportunistic they are. And so, definitely getting the basics right and making sure you're not one of those easy targets, seems an incredibly sensible thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
And James' example before around a CCTV system, if your CCTV system on your plant is connected into your IT network, well, that's a key supplier and that's a key risk. If you've outsourced your IT to a different provider, that's a key risk, because they've got lots of control over your data, and they themselves become a target because of the access they've got. One IT company can have access to data of 100 companies and administrative access to all those companies. So as an attacker, all I've got to do is go after that IT company, or even the IT company's supply chain itself, slowly get into the IT company, and then I've got unrestricted access to 100 companies. So it's just trying to make sure that you're protected from that, both from a cyber hygiene perspective, and James's key point from this, from a contractual liability perspective. If you're outsourcing a key part of your organizational data and managing that data, the contract's got to reflect that risk, and not just, it's not just an IT contract, that they own the security.
Excellent. Right, so I'm conscious of time because it's a little bit past 12. Was there anything from anybody in terms of questions or anything that you wanted to know? Just, I'm always quite keen that everybody walks away, not with questions left behind type thing. So is there anything from anybody?
Yeah, there's something from me, Pim.
Cool.
Could you make sure that I have the slides, please? Because they're great slides. They're really, really, really good.
Yeah, so the
great presentation too, by the way, guys.
Yeah, so the slides will be emailed out to you later today, and it will come with a recording of this webinar as well, and we'll also include the contact details of James, so that if you did want to follow up, then obviously there's the opportunity.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Well organized. Well organized. Really good. Really good time.
So we'll leave it there, I think, for the moment. The one thing that I would ask of you before you leave is to complete a very quick poll for us, please. So we're doing this poll to get your feedback on how this webinar went, but also to get your views on what you would like to see webinars on in the future. So should take about 40 seconds for you to complete. So if you could all have a go at that, that would be good. I'll take this opportunity now to stop the recording and thank all the YouTube viewers for watching. So thanks for watching and see you again.